Now that I'm starting to see a little bit of color on these mushrooms, I'm going to introduce some thyme and also some garlic. And I want to be careful not to burn that garlic. Just a splash of white wine. Those mushrooms are fine. They're done. They're seasoned. They taste great. I'm going to set them aside. We'll revisit those a little bit later on after we've made our rice. Back to the risotto. I'm going to start with foundational flavor, and in this case it's going to be some pancetta that I add to the pan, and I want to render the fat out of this pancetta and start to brown it just a little bit. If you're in a hurry, you can dice this up even smaller. You can almost mince it into very fine pieces of meat, and it will cook very, very quickly. I think of this not as a large garnish that I want to look at, but just a foundational flavor, something that's rich and full and meaty. Next, I'm going to add some onions to this pan, and we'll let those cook right along with the pancetta. If you see the meat leaving behind a little bit of a residue on the bottom of the pan, don't let that burn. It's pure flavor. The way to deal with it is just to introduce a tiny amount of liquid and clean the bottom of the pot up. Sort of scrape that brown off of the bottom. And that way you won't have burnt flavors in your risotto. The rest of the garlic and thyme is going to make its way into the pan. And this represents our foundation of flavor. Next, our short grain arborio rice goes in. And we're going to coat this rice in flavorful fat. And the first addition of liquid is going to be wine. Now, as I cook this, let me sort of explain the process. As I said, there's a particular type of starch that tends to be really sticky. And while pilaf tries to sidestep any stickiness in rice, here in a risotto, we're going to celebrate that stickiness. We're going to use that starch to make a wonderful creamy sauce. The way to tease the starch out of this grain is to add small amounts of liquid and then stir this preparation almost constantly. So you can see I added about 1/2 to 3/4 of a cup of wine, and I stir this at a low temperature so that it maintains a simmer. And off we go. The broth I have hot already so that when I add it, I don't have to wait for it to come up to temperature. And as I said, this should be seasoned already. Now, if you look in this pan, what you'll notice is that first addition of wine has been absorbed. And it's starting to even become a little bit creamy at this early point. Next, I'm going to introduce more stock, but do it incrementally, a little bit at a time. If you give too much liquid, it's almost as if the texture of the grain is spoiled. It gives up a little bit too easy. What you want to do is tease the starch out of this by stirring it and adding liquid incrementally. The reason for the stirring, obviously, is that there's not so much liquid to cover all the rice, and so that which is out of the liquid needs to be stirred down into the liquid so that it can cook properly. Start to finish, a risotto will take you about 18 minutes. And across the 18 minutes, you will be involved with stirring and adding liquid as you go. There's an alternative that I call risotto interruptus. I don't know if that's the true term, but what I'm going to do is add liquid until the rice is about halfway cooked, and then I can take it out of the pan, put it out flat on a cookie sheet so that it can cool quickly, and I can bring it back to the stove shortly before I want to eat it and make the final additions of stock and end up with a dish that is done in 10 minutes rather than 20, so I don't have to leave my guests for so long. Still in all, risotto demands your attention at the end. It's not something that you can make ahead. And if you look in the pan now, you'll start to recognize the creamy sauce that's beginning to take shape. That is exactly as it should be. Before a new addition of liquid, we'll let this cook down and become almost dry, and then we'll move on. What type of a pan is appropriate for a preparation like this? If I used a broad pan, if I used a sautoir, there would be so much surface area, it would be more difficult to stir, but I would also get a lot of evaporation, and consequently, I might run out of stock. If I take a pan that is too close, maybe it's difficult to maintain a simmer. So, a pan that is the right size for the job, I think, is what you want. I have the rice here. It's about 2 inches thick in the bottom of the pan, and I feel pretty good about this pan for making this risotto. If you look, a lot of the liquid has been absorbed, and so we move on and add more. We'll carry on this way for about 15 minutes. And then I would suggest you get in and you take a grain of rice and you taste it. You make sure that it is starting to get tender. If it's not ready to go, there'll be a chalky, hard center to each grain of rice. If you take a single grain and bite into it and look at the cross-section, you'll see that white, chalky center. You need to continue to cook until that has gone away. All right, if you look into this pan now, you can see it's very creamy. I'm going to taste the rice, and it is what the Italians would say al dente, to the tooth. It still is firm, but tender. I'm going to take the mushrooms and add them to the risotto right now. This is the garniture that's making its way into our dish, and this will give the mushrooms an opportunity to flavor this risotto. From this point on, as we approach completion, it's important to monitor the texture of your risotto, because if you add too much liquid, it will be soupy. If you don't add enough liquid, it will be dry. So just keep your eye on the prize. Think with the end in mind. Traditionally, you finish risotto with butter and you finish risotto with cheese. And so I'm going to take care of that right now. I'm going to add a knob of butter. And I'm going to grate some cheese into the risotto. And it's a good idea to do this before you evaluate the finished seasoning, because the richness and the salty, savory flavor of the cheese will impact the finished dish. At this point, as the rice approaches completion, be a little bit careful that you don't stir too aggressively. Sort of fold things in. And what you really want is a preparation that holds its shape, but just barely. So it should hold its shape on a spoon without running off and being too liquid. Needs a little salt. I'm going to add some pepper. And at this point, as we approach completion, I'm going to take some green herbs. I've got chives and I've got parsley, and we'll introduce those into the risotto as well. And stir them in. By adding them right at the end, they'll hold on to their fresh flavor and bright green color. I think I'd like just a little more cheese. Risotto is a rich preparation, and a lot of people don't understand that. I worked for a chef once who, if you called and said, could you make a risotto without cheese or butter, he would say, I'll do almost anything, but I'm not willing to do that. And that's always stuck with me. Okay, I'm going to turn the heat off. The rice is tender. It holds its shape on the spoon, but it's still moist. It barely holds its shape. This is a wild mushroom risotto. I could make a risotto that has shrimp or seafood in it, and that seafood would be added towards the end. I could make a spring vegetable risotto with peas and asparagus and baby carrots. And over the top, just a little more cheese. This might be something that happens at the table. You take it out and each person can add a little cheese to their own taste. I love the look of a little bit of dark pepper. And that's Risotto 101.